The new agenda will be the focus of, in foreign affairs, the focus of Mr. Wirth's remarks. The former senator from Colorado was educated at Harvard, where he received both his, if that isn't redundant to say that, both his Bachelor of Arts degree and his master's degree. He received his PhD from Stanford. He had that very honorific position of White House Fellow, and then was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Education in the Nixon years. He served in the House of Representatives for 12 years from Colorado, and in the United States Senate for 6. He was co-chair of the Clinton-Gore campaign. His career in the House and Senate was marked by success in a number of areas. I think he's particularly well known for his work in the environmental area. But his position, which he holds today, I think is especially interesting. His responsibilities include population, the environment, science, counter-narcotics, terrorism, democracy, human rights, and refugees. It's a little bit like the famous introduction which a somewhat stilted Charles Percy gave for Everett McKinley Dirksen, where he introduced it by saying, E is for excellence, V is for... And after a long period of time and many groans, Hubert Humphrey followed him to the podium. And he said, my name is Hubert Horatio Humphrey, indicating that he might too, of course, start with H's for sons. But that large number of responsibilities is, of course, most interesting because it suggests that problems of certain kinds are extraordinarily important to this administration. And it's an organizing of state, at least on the surface, on something other than merely a geographic orientation. It also suggests that those variety of topics, pro-democracy and human rights and other matters, are somehow defining for the current administration. And that in that concern, it might be a little bit different than previous administrations. And so as the United States attempts to articulate and develop a foreign policy somewhat analogous to the great containment policy following World War II, our thoughts are at least drawn in this direction of a somewhat different orientation. Mr. Wirth, I think, with his closeness to the Clinton campaign, probably in spirit is close to this endeavor, and so I think we're I'm assuming, extraordinarily fortunate in having someone who understands that particular thrust present to us a view of the contemporary foreign policy and its agenda. I hope I've suggested the right direction for his remarks. In any case, it's my enormous pleasure to introduce Mr. Wirth to you.
Frank, thank you very much. What a nice introduction. Especially nice since my mother-in-law is here. And she believed every word of it, Frank. Thank you ever so much. Alice Muth, I hope you all know, and if you don't, she is, as we all try to manage chaos in the world of 1994, Alice is one of those people that brings order to our lives. You all learned that. It's really nice to be back in Baltimore. Thank you very much. I mean, what a remarkable day. You know, you sort of think about transitions in the world. I mean, that funeral going on in California as we all are all meeting here, and that remarkable set of votes going on in South Africa. Did any of you see the faces of people voting yesterday? I mean, it was just incredibly moving, wasn't it? And whoever would have imagined that we have this opportunity and have the responsibility of all this change around us? What extraordinarily exciting times. I thought what I would do today is to talk a little bit about you know, how we are trying to think about the world around us, that foreign policy world which you all deal with so nicely. I was given a glass of wine here. I'll put it right there. Excuse me. That you all have had many, many speakers who are a lot more knowledgeable than I about this, but my job is really not to deal with the day-to-day operations, but rather to try to think out where we're going, and I'd like to share some of that with you. And I thought a good way of starting would be with a question that I got yesterday. I met with a group of student editors, and these were the hot-ticket young, self-styled Scotty Restons or Rush Limbaughs of 1994. And this one young guy who was the editor of the Crimson at Harvard raised his hand, and he said, he asked, "Where is American foreign policy going, and why isn't it there yet?" Where is American foreign policy going, and why isn't it there yet? I mean, I wrote it down for tonight because I thought it was such a great question. And he was asking it in something of a facetious way. But also, I mean, it's a very, very real question. I mean, where are we going, and what are the constraints between where we are now and where we want to go? I think those are the issues that we're all trying to grapple with. I mean, clearly, this is a time of enormous change. I don't have to say to all of you, how it's become almost trite to talk about the post-Cold War world. Our lives, everybody in this room had his or her sense of the world defined by the Cold War. It defined who we were as a country. It defined much of our values. It was really a definition of the good people versus the bad people, the white hats versus the black hats, the Democrats versus the communists, those interested in market systems versus centralized economy. I mean, it was a very clear definition of who we were. And for 50 years, we organized a set of institutions to respond to that confrontation, to respond to that definition of what the world looked like. And we organized a whole set of establishments and a whole series of financial commitments to reach our policy, which, as pointed out in the introduction, was one of containment. We decided after some good deal of troubling thought from 1945 to about 1948 that we arrived at a policy which was defined by containment and established a set of institutions and an enormous commitment of scarce national resources to reach those goals. We set up a vast web of U.S. foreign policy relationships, bilateral country-to-country relationships around the world, with a very, very skilled foreign service, defined particularly by its role in politics, political reporting, I mean reporting on who was a communist and who wasn't, who were friends of ours and who weren't. We established an AID network around the world in which we committed a good deal of money to helping the world develop. And by the way, we really favored those who allowed us to base F-16s in their country or to steam through their straits. So our AID was very closely tied to the Cold War. We established a set of military operations around the world, which we still have. I would remind you that the budget today for the Department of Defense is $270 billion in 1994 dollars. At its height, it was about $300 billion. We've come down from 300 to about 270 in the area of defense. How much is that compared to what? In 1980, at the height of the Cold War, when we had a transition from Carter to Reagan, in 1980, the defense budget in 1994 dollars was $150 billion. So we've gone from 150 to 270. The Cold War is over, just to give you a sense of where the dollars are. In intelligence, we also established a set of institutions which gave us some sense of comfort that we were understanding where the opposition was. In 1980, that budget for intelligence was $15 billion. Again, these are all 1994 dollars. I mean, they're all calibrated, taking into account inflation and changes. In 1980, we were spending $15 billion on defense. Today, on intelligence. Today, the Cold War is over. We're spending, according to the New York Times, $30 billion on intelligence. Give you a sense of where the institutions are and what we set up. A very significant foreign service, a USAID program focused on the Cold War, a defense program focused on the Cold War, an intelligence program focused on the Cold War. And like very large bureaucratic institutions, they tend to steam away, heading in that direction, even though the Berlin Wall is down, even though that remarkable change came about. I mean, there are a few experiences that we have related to our own lives and how that change comes. And I remember when the Berlin Wall went up in the summer of 1961. I was a private in the United States Army, and as the Berlin Wall went up, we were all put on high alert, and we thought we were going to war in Central Europe in that summer of 1961. 30 years later, my kids sat on the top of that same Berlin Wall with 650,000 other young people from all over the United States, Europe, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe, sat on the top of the remains of that wall listening to a Pink Floyd concert. I mean, what an extraordinary shift of generation. And here, my generation, our time, built these institutions that are going this way, and our kids are growing up in a world that is going this way. The world that we live in is so dramatically different, and it is our job to try to bring these institutions around, turn that tiller, move it very rapidly, so that we can begin to respond to the world of the 21st century. And what does that world of the 21st century look like? It is a portfolio of daunting challenges in the midst of extraordinarily rapid change. And let me just give you a few of the top priority issues that we have to think about. Last year in October, the President went to the United Nations and spoke at the United Nations General Assembly, as the President does almost every year. In his speech to the General Assembly, President Clinton outlined three broad priorities: nuclear nonproliferation, peacekeeping, and population and sustainable development. The first two, relatively familiar. I mean, our concerns of nuclear nonproliferation remain, concerns of trying to do everything we can to get the existing nuclear powers to agree to disassemble their nuclear weapons, having some success with Ukraine, some success with Kazakhstan, trying to help the Russians to limit their arsenal, major questions of what to do with plutonium, and very, very significant issues of trying to keep others from joining the nuclear club. And we all read about North Korea about every other day, back in the news. Very significant and difficult problem, but relatively familiar to all of us. We know what the implications are and know what has to be done. It's a matter, again, of mobilizing resources to focus on that. Peacekeeping, a very difficult issue, a very very, very troubling one, ranging all the way from who's going to pay the tab, when do we commit troops to go into various areas, who's going to be in charge, what's the chain of command look like, are American soldiers going to go to war under the command of somebody who is a non-American, something that has never happened before in our nation's history. What's our relationship to the politics of the United Nations, where the decisions get made? Will we continue to maintain our leadership of NATO? A set of familiar issues. I mean, they look somewhat like post-Cold War issues with many of the same characteristics. Those are the first two: nuclear nonproliferation, peacekeeping. And then there's the third bundle of issues that is emerging very rapidly, with which we have very little experience. And it's those, I'll just touch on a few of those, talk about the institutional constraints from taking them on, and then get to your questions. First and foremost, population. When the President spoke to the United Nations in September last fall, he was the first American president to speak in an international assemblage about the importance of population as an extremely powerful variable in determining our future. We had had a population policy in the United States that really began, interestingly, with Richard Nixon, who was a very, very good president on the issue of population and the environment, institutionalized the first office for population, had the first line items in the budget for population, and began the USAID program on population stabilization. That faded with President Carter and then was totally eclipsed under Reagan and Bush, and we really ran a kind of shadow hidden population stabilization program out of the interstices of AID that nobody really knew about, but we tried to keep these things going, and programs were kept going around the world. When the Clinton-Gore administration came in January of 1993, they recognized that this was a problem of extraordinary importance. We now are at 5.7 billion people in the world, growing by 100 million people per year. As this population has doubled since the 1950s, it's going to double again by 2025 or 2030. And if the population does double again, it will leave most countries in the world with very few opportunities to provide chances to their citizenry of housing, health care, jobs, whatever it may be, as their standard of living, with more and more people, their average standard of living is declining. It was said in the early 1970s quite glibly that economic development is the best contraceptive. That was an idea that sounded good if you say it fast enough, but in fact the development was going maybe ever so slightly up. Population was increasing very dramatically, and as any seventh grade student studying algebra will be able to tell you, that gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and how do you intervene in that gap is the crucial question that we face. And intervene we must if we're going to provide any opportunities to those countries, and they provide opportunities to themselves. If we're going to maintain any modicum of political stability, one has to do is look at countries with vast numbers of unemployed, somewhat educated young people who see very little future for themselves within the existing system. And third, if we are truly committed to the idea of preserving the environment and understand the necessity of preserving the environment and that fabric which supports life on this earth, or preserving God's creation, if we have any opportunity for providing chances to people, political stability, and the environmental issues, we understood right away that we had to dramatically increase our attention to population. And we have done so. The budget has been increased very, very significantly for global population stabilization programs. We've taken the lead in the so-called Cairo Conference, which is coming up this September, which is a United Nations conference on population. Will bring the leadership of the world together, help to catalyze support for these issues. The United States is way out front on this, really leading and helping the developed world to provide support to the developing world, which almost universally, and let me underline this, the developing world almost universally wants to stabilize their own population. We are way beyond a north-south question or the white man's burden telling the non-white world what to do or whatever. Almost every country in the world now realizes that they must stabilize their own population. If we don't do so, the world that we're going to leave to our children and grandchildren will be dramatically different from the one today, and the change will not be a pretty one. A second set of issues revolves around the environment. Become familiar in 1992 with the Earth Summit in Rio. That was the collection of world leaders that came together on the environment, just as the world leaders will come together in Cairo on the question of population. At the Rio Summit, there were two very, very large and sort of overarching issues. One of those was global climate change, and the other was biodiversity. The previous administration did not understand, the Bush administration stumbled very badly in Rio, did not understand the power of those issues politically in this country, didn't understand what very strong constituencies the environment had developed in the United States. And I believe that the activities of the Bush administration in Rio, it was the single foreign policy event that had more to do with the election of 1992 than anything else. The pundits would have told you going into the election that Desert Storm and the Bush administration's success in Desert Storm made a difference in the election of 1992. I would say there was not one person whose mind was changed as a result of Desert Storm. People who were going to vote for Bush voted for him. People who were going to vote against him voted against him. That great middle ground was not influenced one iota by Desert Storm. The major issue that catalyzed lots of people was Rio, and that's an environmental community in the United States, a very powerful constituency that is not tree-hugging Sierra Clubbers, but is a very middle-class League of Women Voters, Garden Club of America, group like this, the Council on Foreign Relations, people who think about the environment, understand the environment, are people who are committed and work in political campaigns. This was one of the most important issues to them and to a large undecided group in that campaign. Rio made a tremendous amount of difference. What were those issues? Again, the two most important ones were global climate change and biodiversity. Global climate change, meaning the vast amount of greenhouse forcing gases, predominantly carbon, that we're putting up into the atmosphere, with the potential of sharply changing the face of the world and the way in which living things relate to each other and the environments in which they are found. Not a short-term problem, a problem that is maybe affecting us today, and there's overwhelming consensus in the world that in fact global climate change is there and is going to occur. There is a greenhouse effect. Very little scientific evidence now as to exactly where, how fast, and how much temperatures are going to change, but it is going to happen. We have got to intervene there, and this administration has moved to do that. Second, the Biodiversity Treaty, a wonderfully promising opportunity for us. Biodiversity is that genetic promise which is all around the globe. There are probably about 100 million species on the face of the globe. We have so far cataloged 1.5 million. To give you a sense of where the priorities have been, we can measure the distance to the moon to a matter of centimeters. We can't identify and analyze the number of species on the face of the earth to a factor of 10. Enormous amounts that we have to learn, and enormous promise there of this extraordinary genetic pool. We used to think, say, of our grandparents out prospecting. I think of my grandfather out working and prospecting and working for gold and silver and coal, or a next generation that was out looking for oil and natural gas. The prospecting of the 21st century, the century of biology, is going to be out prospecting within the genetic pool for those compounds that will lead us to wonderful new opportunities in the area of fuel, fiber, pharmaceuticals, food. I mean, a whole variety of wonderful possibilities for us, and a great chance that we have of linking technology in the North to the patrimony of the South, pulling North and South together. A great opportunity that we have, again, for reaching to our commitments to preserve, again, God's creation, preserve the environment, preserve what's out there, and have a very strong economic reason for people doing it. Tremendous chance that we have, and we are embarked upon the ratification of this treaty. I had the opportunity last week of leading the administration's testimony in getting starting the process of ratification of the Biodiversity Treaty before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I've been in the Congress for about 20 years, and been in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hearings, and you know when a hearing is together and when it's not. And when we came into that room with this alliance that had been developed between the government, the pharmaceutical industry, the biotechnology industry, the public sector, the private sector, all of the environmental groups allied behind the extraordinary future promise of this and what the United States had to do and should do in our own self-interest and in the globe's self-interest in moving on this extraordinarily important issue. You could just feel the energy in that hearing room. It was incredibly exciting. That issue is one that you all will hear a great deal more about, and one which we are moving rapidly to try to get a handle on. Let me touch on a final one, issue of change. Again, relatively unknown, or we really aren't 100% sure what to do, but we know that that issue is out there and one that we're going to try to have to handle, and that's the issue of counter-narcotics. As the other three are promising, on issues of what we can do in population, what we can do in the area of global climate change, what we can do in biodiversity, the issue of counter-narcotics is much meaner and much more difficult. Think for a minute about going to the movies in the early 1970s and seeing your first James Bond thriller. And in that, you remember the gentleman with the cat. What was his name, Belia? The guy with the white cat, do you remember? Anyway, these incredible symbols of evil. These characters in Ian Fleming's characters that had assumed a vast amount of power, had huge amounts of money, had armies of people who were intensely loyal to them for various reasons, and who had access to a huge amount of weaponry which they were willing to use for all of the evil purposes which they personified. And we all were relatively entertained by these individuals. They are now a reality in the form of the leaders of the drug cartels around the world. Individuals with vast amounts of cash, buying off governments, having bought off police forces, internal security regimes, and able to purchase in the post-Cold War arms market just about anything that's available out there. Anybody in this room, if you have enough money, can go out and buy just about anything you want. These people are doing it. An extraordinarily dangerous set of influences, which we first experienced in the Andes, are now, we've had some successes in Bolivia and in Colombia and in Peru. It is spreading in the Andean area, spreading through Central America, frightening in what's happening in West Africa, and the narcotics control, say, of Nigeria, that military government absolutely corrupt and taken over almost absolutely by the drug individuals. The problems that exist in Central and Eastern Europe and in Russia. Initially a cocaine traffic, now being added to by a new and vicious strain of heroin coming in from Burma, Southeast Asia. A vicious strain because it is purer and it is cheaper than anything that we have seen before. And that is now showing itself in Russia, showing itself in Europe, and we're beginning to see signs of that in a new epidemic in New York and Los Angeles, which will spread in this country. The commitments that we have to try to do everything we can to confront this problem as it exists and to get other nations in the world to join us in this confrontation. They now recognizing, thank goodness, that this is not just Uncle Sam's problem, even though we were first on the block with the problem. It is now a problem that pervades everywhere, developed and developing countries. We're getting great cooperation and learning, what works and what doesn't work. And it's our job to try to build upon the successes that we had in the past and to try a variety of new things in the area of counter-narcotics. Very, very dangerous, very challenging for us, and about as evil as anything that any of us will see in our lifetimes. Those are 4 of the new challenges that we face. Very, very different way of thinking about foreign policy and thinking about how we organize our institutions of government and our thinking about the future. Not easy by any means. Again, to go back to where I started, think about all those institutions that are headed this way. Vast commitments of money to defense programs, vast commitments of money to intelligence programs, a State Department generally organized to think about political reporting. And what we have to do is to move that around and make commitments that are different, to move money into the areas of population, into the areas of counter-narcotics, to help understand the promise and reach the promise of biodiversity, to help stem the tide, stem the growth of greenhouse-forcing gases, to change the reward structure of these institutions, to get the Congress to understand that we got to spend less money here and spend more money over there, and to get the American public to understand that these are enormously important investments for us all to be making for the future. Fortunately, and I will close with this, it's probably on the latter front that we have the best luck. The polls in this country, public opinion polls of every kind, talking to the American public about foreign aid are finding out 2 things. First, you ask people what they think about foreign aid, they'll say, we don't like foreign aid, cut foreign aid. But then when you ask them a different sort of a question, fill in the blank, what are the problems that you think are out there that your government ought to be working on? They will come back and answer 3 over and over and over again. Population, the environment, and narcotics. The American public knows. It's really extraordinary. I just sent to all the senior people in the White House this afternoon a new poll that was out, done by the Pew Charitable Trust, of 2,000 people across the country. Very sophisticated polling and very exciting, saying that the American public is saying, if you do this, this is what we will support. At a time, when people are sort of looking for what can we do, where do we get the political moxie to carry out the mission that we have and fulfill our responsibilities the way we must. These are extraordinarily exciting times to move this ship of state around in a totally different direction, to understand that we're now thinking about what Abraham Lincoln used to call, you remember that word, posterity. An old-fashioned word that's not used very much anymore, but is absolutely the one that we all must be thinking about. These are areas where we can have a tremendous amount of consequence for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and where they will certainly be looking at us and measuring us 30 years from now or 50 years from now, will be saying to us, where were they when this transition had to be made, and were they willing to face up to it? The question now really isn't, do we know what to do, but will we have the political will to mobilize ourselves to do what must be done? Those are the challenges that we face, and those are the challenges that are going to take all of the input and goodwill of people like yourselves, gathered, concerned, and interested. And we are deeply appreciative of you coming out tonight And I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much for asking me. Question, I mean, it really fundamentally is related to American credibility, in the world today, and what kind of support do we have politically for undertaking a very complicated task? And that's a very, very good question. I mean, not one to be taken lightly. First of all, we're engaged in a new set of challenges that nobody has dealt with before. I mean, I say that, and I think most people would agree with that. I think it's hard to find anybody who has had a wealth of experience. These things take a while. Second, we're at a time where in almost every administration, and I say this as a good Democrat, but as almost every administration, people learn on the job. I mean, I've been seeing a lot of administrations come in. You have a chance to learn. All of this hit very rapidly, and there hasn't much of a time to learn. You're up at warp speed right away, and to get a team together that works. Third, related to this, and I don't have to tell you this, the American public voted last fall predominantly on a domestic agenda, and the only part of the foreign policy agenda is the one that I referred to earlier, I think, that had any kind of power to it at all. The President has made it very clear that his number one concern has been the domestic area, and has delegated to a team that's known each other for a long time the foreign policy responsibilities. The Yugoslavia issue we inherited, and I think that probably most observers would suggest that that issue should have been attacked much earlier. We tried to do that, as you may remember, in March when Secretary Christopher went around the NATO capitals and got a resounding negative. That is now being played out again, almost the same discussions being played out again, related to the allowance of the Bosnians to arm themselves. What are the implications of that for American policy and for the Europeans? That debate is going on right now as the Secretary is once again, as we speak, in Europe, going to European capitals and trying to understand where the Europeans are and where we ought to go. I think that there was some miscommunication on the Garage Day issue, and that the United States did the right thing by pushing very hard for a response there. We have to calibrate that response, as I don't have to tell you very carefully, because I do not think that there are very many Americans who would like to see us get deeply involved in the issues of Bosnia, to get involved on the ground. What is the exit strategy? There isn't one. I think that you look at that particular situation and that particular history, once you get in, it's very hard to get out again, and hovering out there as well, as you know, Mr. Altman, is the sort of the very bitter history of Southeast Asia, and getting in without an understanding of what your goals were and how you're going to get out at the other end. Haiti is very different. I think that we are attempting in Haiti to root a democratic system of democratic institutions in a country that may well not be able to do that, at least at this point. Haiti looks more like West Africa, than it does like any other place in the Western Hemisphere. We are all alone in our concerns about Haiti. I can tell you that there is nobody else, who has any concern whatsoever about what goes on in Haiti, and in fact are saying no. The Haiti refugee problem, nobody wants to have anything to do with it, as you can imagine. And it is a brutally difficult question on all the grounds of economics and politics and population. Let me just tell you a brief sidebar story, which is illustrative of where we are. At the United Nations General Assembly meetings last fall, as at every meeting, the Secretary will have a whole series of discussions with various countries. And we had a half an hour scheduled with Malval, the Prime Minister of Haiti, a really terrific and very, very impressive individual. And the Secretary was a little bit late, and I was to be the other person with the Secretary at the meeting. And I sat down with Mr. Malval, and we were chatting, and he said, "I've never met with the Secretary of State before. What do I say?" Right? And I said to him, "Well, Mr. Malval, just tell him a little bit about your country." The Secretary came in. They have our obligatory, everybody has their talking points, and all seen this happen. And Malval did his 15 minutes, and the Secretary did his 15 minutes. The half an hour was up, and the Secretary apologized and said that he had to move. And the Prime Minister said, Mr. Secretary, if you'll allow me, I would like to just tell you one other thing, tell you a little bit about my country. He said, Mr. Secretary, my country currently has a population of 7 million people. That is unsustainable ecologically, economically, and politically. By the year 2012, in 18 years, the population of my country is going to double. And that was it. I mean, that's what he chose to tell the Secretary of State of the United States of America about his country. I mean, that's an extraordinary sort of commentary. Imagine that you would decide that that's what you would tell somebody about your country. I mean, I thought it was just a stunning remark. You know, what we do with Haiti and where we are right now is just up in the air. I mean, it's a lot of very, very bad, and I will tell you, very lonely choices. Did we do the wrong thing last fall when the troop ship came in and, remember, into the harbor and then turned back? Would that have gotten us involved with ground troops in Haiti? Is there any American stomach for ground troops in Haiti? Probably not. That's one choice. A second choice is to allow a vast number of Haitian refugees to come and take in all of the Haitian refugees. There's no home for them anyplace else in the Caribbean. Is there any stomach in America for that? Probably not. Do we want to cut a deal of some kind with the authorities in Haiti, illegal and repugnant as they may be, to calm everything down? That is a third option, which is a bad one. And the fourth option is to tighten the sanctions to try to squeeze the leadership in Haiti, which will probably hurt people at the bottom end of the economic scale more than they're already being hurt. That is also a very bad alternative. There is not a good alternative for what goes on in Haiti. And we have been thinking in both Bosnia and Haiti, maybe one of the problems is in this day and age, everything's on television. And this is a young and very open administration that talks out loud. I mean, the administration and the president muses. He likes to do that. He likes to think out loud. This is an incredibly bright, energetic individual who is thinking about all these things. And sometimes he does that in public and probably has to learn not to do that. Probably people maybe don't want to see that happen. On the other hand, a lot of my daughter's friends were over the other night talking about the president thinking out loud, and they were just astonished. I said, it was really interesting. They were sort of relating to that happening. And I probably had the same reaction either. I wish he hadn't done that, right? But he was sort of thinking out loud and trying to sort through a set of very, very bad options. If you look at other things, there are other things that have gone pretty darn well. I think we're handling the North Korean thing right. I think that that is going well. I think that obviously the free trade agreement and Canada, U.S., Mexico, was well done and done right in the face of very significant political opposition. The completion of the GATT economic round, trade round, was very important, and the commitment of the administration to take the next step and include a series of other issues in the next round of GATT was a very important thing to do. Unknown but very successful have been a broad series of negotiations with the Japanese, which we've been trying to show the world that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can fight over trade, but we can do a whole lot of other things as well. These have not gotten the attention, and maybe they don't deserve the attention, I don't know. I mean, I think they're a lot more important than Bosnia, or certainly than Haiti, probably on a world scene. And Bosnia, we don't know how that's going to play out. Yours is a very good question, Mr. Altman, and I think we would like to see absolute decisions being made, yes, no, up, down, black, white, whatever it may be. But as pointed out in the 4 Haitian options, we don't have a clear up, down, black, white, good, right, wrong option in Haiti. They're all lousy. Final note. A group of us had dinner with the Vice President last night, and we were talking about many of these same issues, and he put it in a very nice way. He said, we are accustomed to thinking that we can manage chaos. We probably can't. What we ought to put our emphasis on is preventing chaos. Maybe that's what you say. I mean, it was sort of a nice way of thinking about, we're going to have all of these fires going out there, and we're all going to be on the end of these bucking fire hoses, right? And, we ought to be spending more effort, that says, thinking about how do we prevent some of that, and maybe we can, prevent some of these in the long run? So yours is a very, very good question. That was sort of a blockbuster at the start. We ought to stop now and go have a glass of wine. But I appreciate the question. It was a really good question. What should we all be thinking about the linkage of most favored nation status, granting most favored nation status to the government of China in relationship to human rights? We must understand that what the administration was doing, what the President was doing, what Secretary Christopher was doing, was what almost 300 members of the Congress and a very large majority of the Senate had told us to do. That there was going to be this linkage between most favored nation status and human rights in China, and that we were to, given a number of measures quite explicitly laid out in the legislation, in the sense of the Senate, in the sense of the Congress resolution, we were quite explicitly going to grant most favored nation status as to whether or not the Chinese had met these various tests. So we get into the situation now. It may not, going back to the Altman thesis, right? It may not have been handled as graciously, as carefully as it might have been in terms of when we went to China and how that was done. But we had a solid phalanx of Republicans and Democrats of all stripes who were saying this is what our policy has to be. Now, should we have calibrated that policy differently? I mean, there's a lot of different debate about that, and that is currently happening. We're going to calibrate that policy in a different way. And I think inevitably, and your question suggests this, that when you have human rights sitting here and you have this enormous sort of bulldozer or machine of trade, you know, human rights are going to get squashed. I mean, you have so many pressures on it that you have to get the human rights question into the debate in a different way. Don't face the two off one against another. And there are a lot of other ways of doing it, which we're now searching to do. But we were told by the Congress that that's what we were going to do. And so we did it. Right? Well, now we've all learned, and I think that the thing is going to become much, I think calibration is not a bad way of putting it, right? And learn how to explain it in a better way. And you know, the Chinese, interesting about walking and chewing gum at the same time. While we're having this confrontation with the Chinese about human rights, I can tell you my office is deeply engaged with them on environmental issues, on population issues, on counter-narcotics issues, on a whole series of incredibly interesting topics. Now, what we ought to be doing, in my opinion, you know, what we ought to be doing is tying human rights up with that kind of a package and says, we'll work with you here and on here and on here. And this is, we ought to tie them all, get them all tangled around the axle of all of these other things, too. You know, that's, I think that will prove to be a better way of doing this. And I think now the country understands that you can't confront human rights and trade directly in that fashion and do it in a reasonable way, that we got to figure out other ways of working this out. Does that make sense? I don't know if it makes sense, but we're trying, right? Yeah. And asked to hear more about the Cairo conference. What results do we expect and who's attending? The Cairo conference, again, will be held in September from the 5th to the 13th. It will bring together 180 leaders from all over the world who will focus on a basic document which has been drafted over the last 3 years. There have been 3 major what are called preparatory committee meetings, or PrepComs. The third one just completed last week in New York, and you might have seen there was a good deal of press about that, about the Vatican's role in that and their concerns about it and so on. And that document was preceded also by a number of regional conferences in which the Latins got together, and before that the Central Americans got together, and before that the island states in the Caribbean got together. I mean, everybody tries to forge their position as to what they want to see. Coming out of the final PrepCom in New York were some very, very exciting and heartening developments. One, almost overwhelming commitment to population stabilization, everybody doing it. Whereas before, as I said, there was differences between countries and north and south and rich and poor and so on. Everybody in agreement that this is absolutely imperative. Second, that family planning, traditionally defined as the provision of family planning information and services, has got to be broadened. And that broader definition must include the survival of children, child mortality. We know that as people know that their kids are going to survive, are going to live, they're going to want to have fewer children. As child mortality rates go down, fertility rates go down. Has to be supplemented by the education of girls. All evidence is that as girls receive more education, play a greater role in the society, they have more status, they want to have fewer children, they want to space their children, and they have greater capacity in the society to make that particular point felt, and that across all cultures. Third, that this has to be supplemented with a broad commitment to reproductive health, women's reproductive health issues, that thinking about safe motherhood, thinking about the role of women and the care of women in the process and the special needs that women have in the process of conception, in the process of childbearing, in the process of delivering are very different from what men has, and they have to be, and the timing of all of those has to be done right, the management of those has to be done right, and they're very different from what men go through. Right? Now that may to all you women sound that's a perfectly logical thing to do, but people view, well, this is not an androgynous world, right? It isn't. So that was a very important definition, that we're going to broaden the definition of this. And then finally, coming out of this and coming out of Cairo is going to be a striking commitment to grassroots, non-governmental organization, women's organizations all over the world. It is really exciting to see this coalition of citizen groups called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, sort of the new brand of government in the 21st century, popping up first and foremost around women's issues, or around the grassroots groups first found their voice in Rio in 1992. The heroes of the Rio Earth Summit were not governments, they were the environmental groups who went largely defined the agenda and did a very good job of doing it. In 1993, we had the Vienna Conference. These things have come all at one time. The Vienna Human Rights Conference, which was an attempt to reaffirm the basic commitment of the United Nations to human rights and all countries to human rights. There was an attempt to water that down by a number of savory nations like the Cubans and the Yemenis and the Iraqis and so on. But we sailed through, and the women dominated that with the concern about the treatment of women, and the human rights and responsibilities of the world toward women. Right? It was fantastic. I chaired the U.S. delegation. It was really great. It was very exciting. And now to see this happening in New York, now, and that's another piece. So we've had this commitment of resources. The U.S. has been way out front on the resources. We've significantly increased our resources. Are others coming along? Yes. Part of our partnership with Japan is terrific. The Japanese, you get these numbers, they're interesting, a new partnership. The Japanese historically have given about $40 million a year to population. Last month, in the meetings between Clinton and Hosokawa, the Japanese committed themselves to $3 billion over 7 years, which is more than $400 million a year, or a tenfold increase in their contribution. I mean, saying, recognizing the Japanese, we have this responsibility. You only heard about the trade stuff. We've been doing all of these other really interesting things, Mr. Altman, in response to the things that are going right? I mean, this is one of them. I mean, very exciting. The European Union is going to increase their contribution. The Germans are going to double theirs. The British are going to increase theirs. There's going to be a commitment of resources. So on the population in Cairo, it may turn out that the planets are lined up right. That we really are doing the right things. We really have the opportunity to make a tremendous difference in this rapidly growing world population to get to stabilization a lot earlier. Finally, to some, this is very threatening. I mean, the idea of a full spectrum of women's reproductive health issues has to include the issue of abortion and safe motherhood. It has to do that. At a time when there are millions of women around the world who are dying from unsafe abortions every year. That has to be done and has to be recognized. That is very threatening to some. It also has to include, the issue of empowerment of women, and that is also very threatening, just as the idea of NGOs or grassroots empowerment is very important. That's very threatening to existing governments and to institutions that are resistant to the involvement of women. So we're going to still have some shootouts on this front, but it is going to be a very, very exciting time in Cairo. And if we really think about the future, if you get down on all of this stuff, Mr. Altman, there are a lot of really good things going on out there too, right? And there is reason for very significant optimism for all of us to think about what we can do in the area of population, what we can do in the area of biodiversity, and the leadership responsibility that the world asks of us in the United States to take on these extraordinarily important issues. So I'm going to stop on that optimistic note and thank you all very much for asking me to be with you.
was about to take advantage of being moderator and ask another question of Mr. Wirth, which I'm going to state. But it would be interesting to hear your view, I think, at some point, as to whether you believe the policy positions stated by Mr. Clinton during the campaign continues today, and whether it ever existed, or whether it's been modified by events. And what I was thinking of was your answer to the question of Yugoslavia being the hand you were dealt, and Haiti being an intractable problem, which one has to take essentially the previous administration's position on, and of course the position on and pro-democracy not working in Haiti, and the China dilemma being forced on you by Congress, whereas there was an alternative
Getting more
position.
complicated all the time, Frank. I'll answer that question very quickly, all right? One, was the foreign policy very clearly stated by candidate Clinton during the campaign? Yes. Has the policy been carried out very clearly by President Clinton for the last year and a quarter? Yes. Will there be changes made along the way? Yes.
If Mr. Wirth had chosen to run for re-election in Colorado, he certainly would have been successful. We appreciate enormously not only your presentation this evening, but certainly your dedication in your career in public service. And the authenticity, I think, of the positions which you've put forward is unchallengeable. One may not agree with all of them, but I think the earnestness of your career is absolutely clear, and we appreciate very much your forthrightness tonight, your clarity, and for sharing your time with us. We value that enormously. Thank you.